Hello and welcome back. My name is Myre and it's time for the Dynamic Events AMA recap. So this week, the developers from the team that does all the dynamic events decided to go on to Spectrum and field questions from the community. And so here we are checking everything out, and let's just go straight into it. Alright, so Dynamic Events AMA recap. So each month we host an open submission live Q&A on Spectrum, joined by developers from various specialities across CIG. These questions and answers were collected from the Spectrum AMA on September the 8th, 2021. Alright, so this time we welcomed 4 guests from different departments who answered players' most burning questions on how our dynamic events are and providing insights into the decisions we made. Okay. So they had Luke Presley, Edward Fuller, Rob Reiniger, and Ben Dorsey, all from the design team. And then this AMA is complete, but keep an eye out for upcoming threads for your chance to ask anything to the devs. So generally speaking, how this works is that on Spectrum, people ask questions, and then some lucky questions are answered. It's not really on an upvote merit system, but I think that pretty much every single person that was replied to is now on this thing here. So with that, let's get started. So the first question is, the trading stock and replenish rate can be painfully slow. For Jumptown 2, what potential changes, if any, without spoilers, have been considered following similar indications from Ninetales Lockdown, where players were unable to adequately resupply medical supplies? This sometimes slowed the event to a boring stall, which negatively affected its quality, pace, and the work that has been done by the team to make this event work. So, even though the Ninetales Lockdown event didn't last for very long, there was one part of it where you didn't necessarily have to go into combat. You could escort some ships around, or you could actually go ahead and grab medical supplies and then go to the event area and deliver them. But there were some issues with supply and demand, and that kind of stuff didn't really work the way it should do, which is probably where this question is coming from. So Ben Dorsey says, I'm going to answer this question in 2 parts, Jumptown 2 and Ninetales. So for Jumptown 2, I'm actually, disclaimer, barring any unforeseen bugs, spawning the drugs physically rather than having you buy them from a shop. Okay, probably to tie this into in the future when all these commodities are supposed to be physicalized in the first place, perhaps. The inventory then is less, 300 boxes become available across all servers, and more, a box will be made available to spawn every 30 seconds on each server. Interesting how that'll work. So I felt this was both more interesting gameplay-wise, as carrying the cargo out to your ship adds a layer of complexity for physicalized cargo, as that'll be making this more standard across the game. But I didn't want to wait for that. Okay, and I felt that in a PvP-centered event, players on another server being able to take the boxes you are trying to defend/steal defeated a large amount of the gameplay. So, we're kind of in a really interesting state in the game right now where they do want all the servers to essentially be meshed together on the back end, so that like if you're playing in an Australian server, things that you do and the impact you have on the game affects people who are playing in the States. So you can't hop to an empty server and then try and have an advantage. It does seem, however, for the Ninetales Lockdown that they want to do things a bit differently, where instead of having to just, press a button and then automatically get the stuff, there's maybe a pile of stuff, and then so if you have a team of people, then you can of course load the ship faster and that kind of thing instead. How exactly you buy these commodities and if you'll have to or if you won't, we'll have to wait and see. So for Ninetales Lockdown, some of you who participated in the very first Evocati test might actually remember there were shop mods that made it so that shops selling medical supplies had their sell inventories boosted, much like the station has its buy inventory capacity boosted. I was asked to remove those mods to emphasize the derelicts due to Xenothreat feedback. Thanks to the Ninetales feedback that has come in, I was able to rehash that conversation and have hooked the shop mods to sell locations back up at 3.15. So a follow-up reply goes, I covered this very briefly on an ISC segment, but I also have shop mods for sell locations in Jumptown 2 to increase the shop's buy capacity. So again, Jumptown 2 is supposed to be this dynamic event that's supposed to parrot and mirror this original fan community made, I wouldn't call it an event, but kind of like a period within the game where there was one place that was buying stuff for loads, and so there was a lot of natural competition to kind of like control that area. So next up, it's exploits, quick attacks that break the events. Currently, the Xenothreat, a soon I'm sure to be overcome issue, was seen where destroying / attacking the enemy Idris in Phase 3 before the Javelin arrived in the cloud broke the event. Without spoilers, have there been any design changes you've had to make for Jumptown 2 in order to mitigate the chances of event breaking or long stalls? So these are kind of different events, but the head honcho himself, Luke Presley, has this to say. So we saw lots of backers stating this as being the cause, but the Javelin's arrival has no bearing on the spawning of the Idris in logic. The hotfix we attempted was to fix an issue we recognized whereby we attempted to spawn the 2 Idris within a kilometer radius of the wreck of the previous Idris. And if that failed, no Idris was spawned and the mission became incomplete. We had thought this an extremely rare situation as we never encountered it in testing, but then we saw 50 players in large ships mobbing the Idris at the moment of its destruction, and we realized it was a likely culprit of the mission becoming stuck. To prevent this possibility, if the 1 kilometer radius fails, we gradually increase the radius until the spawn succeeds. This fix affects spawns game-wide, so will not be a problem elsewhere or anywhere, Ninetales included. However, this was only our best guess for how to fix the Idris not spawning and the mission becoming stuck, but it seems from player feedback that this has not solved the issue or may have improved it, so further analytics will need to be added to get to the bottom of it. A follow-up reply goes, I was in 2 minds about trying to answer this because I am not a coder, so I'm unable to follow up in greater detail, but I verified my explanation and I think it's worth posting. So knowing when things happen is easy because you get a callback telling you it happened. Knowing when things don't happen is not easy because you never get the callback. The best you can do is put in a timer, and if you don't receive the callback after the time, you assume you never will and abort the mission. The event ran for not even 2 weeks, and the first issue had to happen enough that it became clear it was a serious issue. Then we had to investigate, and because we were unable to reproduce the issue internally, in the end we made our best guess fix, a valuable one to the rest of the game also, rather than add a timer. In hindsight, this may have been a mistake, but we intend to add the analytics we need to catch this issue and solve it properly, as it's likely not limited to this event. So in general, to answer this guy's initial question, well, the issues involving this big bug that broke that event are very different from the issues that might arise from any bugs happening in any subsequent events, because we're talking about spawn points and spawn locations and spawn radiuses being blocked by big ships, whereas, you know, like Jumptown is like a zone and not a ship spawning kind of thing. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what happens. Alright, so simultaneous dynamic events. So currently, pre-alert broadcasts occur across the channel regarding one event so it doesn't conflict with another announcement from another dynamic event, as Xenothreat and Ninetales did not occur simultaneously. But what is the thought process behind simultaneously occurring dynamic events being transmitted to players within the same star system? For instance, Stanton or Star System sector, i.e. around Pyro 4. For example, will only selecting a mission in the contacts or contracts manager under dynamic events allow you to hear Dooley speak, as opposed to how she broadcasts across the whole area? Or will flying into the area where the event is occurring automatically trigger the mission acceptance and pre-alert announcements? Okay. So again, this is for if there are 2 things happening at once, but I guess right now that's not the case because they can choose and trigger when they happen, but eventually there will be a point in the game where these dynamic events happen dynamically, and so there is a possibility where this could happen. So Rob Reiniger says, ultimately, the intention is that there could be any number of things happening in the verse at any given time. We acknowledge that we're currently being extremely heavy-handed with the broadcasting of events because we're using the tools we have at the moment. Ideally, we need to expand our notification system such that it can handle multiple events, queuing messages, and other player-driven controls like controlling the types of messaging they receive. Also, keep in mind that we are in the early stages of this tech, and this will continue to evolve as we move forwards with not only the dynamic event system, but other complementary systems as well. So more or less what we kind of just said there. So it'll just happen in time, and we'll have to wait and see exactly how it goes on once they get the actual systems that will be taking over these older ones in the future. Alright, so far, all dynamic events have been primarily space-oriented. Other than Jumptown 2, are there any plans for a ground-based dynamic event? So Rob Reiniger says again here, dynamic events will ultimately trigger all over the verse based on various conditions being hit that are relevant to the specific mission. This could be at something as small as an outpost or a UGF to comma ray stations or even major landing zones. Okay, is that like a hint there for maybe perhaps an event happening at a city perhaps? So requiring FPS gameplay or ships, Tony Zervek's upcoming CitizenCon presentation will get into some additional details, but rest assured we want this type of content happening all over the universe, not just for larger scale space battles. Edward Fuller adds, yes, we want to incorporate more ground-based scenarios once we have AI capable of navigating on the planet's surfaces. And on the monthly report, they keep talking about AI and the AI nav mesh, the navigation mesh, allowing the AI to be able to move from space to EVA to going to ground and all this stuff. So once all that kind of comes in, once the servers eventually, are able to do what they're supposed to, then maybe perhaps we'll be able to see more of this more often. So will future dynamic events offer reputation-based rewards for players choosing to side with Xenothreat to fight the CDF? I'm not really quite sure about Xenothreat. It's one of those things, but hey, I mean, you can play as the Imperials in Star Wars, can't you? So Luke Presley says, whenever it is we next run the Xenothreat event, it is my personal hope and intent that we have the necessary clarity of markers to deliver it with a counter mission for Xenothreat supporters. So I honestly think that this is important, but I am going to actually add to this in a second. So if the assumption is we get a counter mission, my assumption would be that rewards based on reputation would be available. This is not mine to promise, but I do see it as the next big and exciting thing to properly tackle. Plans have been made on improving the way we communicate things like hostility, lawful right to attack, and ally status based on tracked mission, which will make these epic counter missions possible. So yeah, right now in the game we don't really have the ability to determine friend from foe apart from if they've done damage to you or if they have criminality. If somebody does damage to you, they go from green to red, but to everybody else around you, unless that crime has been recorded, they are still green, so your friends cannot stop them from killing you. And then we have all other things like that as well. As the game matures, we'll finally have the ability to have these clear markers that'll allow you to go ahead and pick a mission that will make you a red target by default, so people will know exactly what's going on, and vice versa. If somebody has the same mission as you and they are supposed to be helping you in that mission, like all these dynamic events kind of tend to do, then you will have that as well. I think it's incredibly important that for these dynamic events, there are counter missions as well as your normal mission, because essentially, there are many different kinds of player out there. And if you do not cater specifically for people who want to do PvP, then they're gonna show up anyway. So you may as well factor this in and cater to it if you are to have this true sandbox experience. Give the people who do want the PvP somewhere to go and make it so that the reward that they get for doing the PvP and for focusing on those specific tasks is higher than it would be to just go into the fray and essentially destabilize the event for everybody else. Right now, we did not really have that, and so when people did go ahead and say, I want a PvP, people are over here, I'm gonna PvP here, people were calling them griefers, when that's not necessarily the case. It's just, you know, in bird person language, a dick move. So anyway, any plans for a non-combat profession centered dynamic events, for example, involving mining and refining, I hope. So Rob Reiniger says, ideally, we will have dynamic events that cover the entire breadth of our content feature sets. As soon as we have mining functional within the core missions, something you can take from a mission giver or the contract manager, I would expect us to look for ways to incorporate that into our dynamic content. And so Xenothreat was really cool because it did incorporate pretty much every single gameplay aspect in the game, except for, you know, mining. And to some degree as well, also like proper, well, not even proper, but like traditional trade, right? Then that's kind of what Xenothreat then added. So mining would be pretty cool, like having, if not a dynamic event with like, you know, like actual consequence, then at the very least, perhaps, you know, like adding some sort of like just big mission that happens every now and then, you know, like, oh, Synthworld has a massive order, how can we possibly, like, you know, like make up this order, and then like they're gonna put like a massive call to arms for, or, you know, supply call for a whole bunch of stuff. That'd be kind of cool. So how will the future of dynamic events take advantage of all the space and interesting locations in Stanton and not be subjected to one particular area in the corner? So, you know, with Xenothreat, it was basically like sequestering the entire population of the stream into Mike L1, this one pinpoint like spot on the map. So Rob says one thing to keep in mind is that we are using the current events that we have to build out necessary tech and prove out a scenario for a single location before we try and trigger them in any of the locations in the verse. This helps us zero in on issues related to mission logic as well as identify any location markup that the mission may need, i.e. there is no reason to mark up every possible location until you know exactly what the setup needs are. Oftentimes, we refine the experience as we go as well. So what we initially implement might not be the final experience, and there is no sense going wide until we're happy with it. So again, this entire like, you know, tier 0 implementation, we're in alpha. Xenothreat, when we had it at the beginning of this year, is not the same as we had it, you know, like a couple of weeks ago, and it's not going to be the same the next time it comes around. It's a iterative process, and as they, you know, keep refining it, we'll get there eventually. That said, these will ultimately be something that can happen in as many locations as possible, so as our technology continues to grow, I would expect that more and more of our locations get utilized with the content we're pushing forward with it. So in the future, will there be a mechanism which uses RNG to determine which dynamic events will become active? So Rob then goes ahead and says, we are working extremely hard to build a system that can and will react to conditions that are running on a back-end simulation. While this still involves some level of probabilistic math here, the intent is that some benchmark will hit through either 1, the player's interaction within the world, or 2, through some level of virtual AI decisions that have caused some level of imbalance in the world. While RNG are used here and there, it's often for things like which cluster of enemies to throw at you during a random or not so random encounter. But the bottom line is that we want the world to be something that the players can understand and potentially learn what warning signs to look out for, or else X or Y will likely happen. That said, this won't prohibit us from randomly triggering things at any moment. You know, like a dev or a dev game master can just press a button and, you know, do something if they wanted to, but they also want it so that, like, let's say that, let's say that nobody has been doing any trade missions going to one of the Lagrangian point stations, right? So this station is not doing so well. If a player was to randomly go there, they would notice that within the station, the like the wear and tear shaders have kind of gone down to like really low. It's destitute. All the all the NPCs aren't looking so happy. That kind of thing. Warning signs maybe perhaps that Ninetales might see this as a sign of weakness and try and lock down the station in order to try and capture it. That kind of thing. So are dynamic events really necessary with the current state of the game servers, lag, and desync? So Edward Fuller says, building dynamic events and running them now is absolutely necessary and beneficial as an important part of our development of the game. They act as test beds that expose problems in both the event's mission system and the interplay of other gameplay systems as well as back-end systems. The features, discoveries, and leanings that we take from building and running these events now leads to even better events further down the line. So he's saying, in a nutshell here, that yes, it's entirely necessary to at least try and make events and stuff while things are broken, in terms of like netcode and that kind of thing, because otherwise you're just kind of waiting, sitting your thumbs until, of course, the day comes and you can still make like valid discoveries this early on. It's kind of similar to how Clive Johnson, one of the lead network guys, was saying how well, yes, the game has to essentially run the way it is here as we're doing things like working on server meshing and that kind of thing, 30Ks and stuff all rife. All these things kind of necessarily have to run in tandem because they're working on making server meshing, and so because of that, like the stuff, the framework that we're playing on, even though it's not strong, cannot be strengthened by the netcode guys, because otherwise, time and developer hours or whatever will go into something that will eventually just be cast away once they then get into implementing the actual netcode or whatever. So yeah. The whole, active, iterative spiel that we get all the time. So, what things have you learned and are going to change with regards to crime stats for lawful players during these events? Okay, so crime stats for lawful players during these events. So Luke Presley here says, we have learned a lot from the current run of Xenothreat as well as from first releases, which was our first attempt at a large-scale fleet battle. As such, we learned a lot about the kind of issues that only present when many players and AI get together in one place to fight. The major standouts we wanted to address for the second release were our simplistic friendly fire system, which led to unfair crime stats. We made major strides in friendly fire arbitration, which drastically cut down the number of unfair crime stats awarded according to the feedback and analytics we received on the event, and it allowed us to more accurately identify the remaining edge cases. I was victim to one of these edge cases where I was flying and all of a sudden I just randomly got a crime stat. So what's great is this kind of change improves the whole game. Not just the event, and paves the way for more large-scale battles in the future. Now that the system is generally fairer, a lot of the noise has been cut out and we are now able to identify the specific remaining issues. I can see there is still work to do on the collision side, so that it will be our next focus, as well as some changes I'm sure backers will love, but I can't get into yet. I wonder what those are. The crime system is one of those things where it's really cool that it exists, but it's kind of rough and it's not very fair, so any changes to make it more fair and to make it less of a nuisance, I'm sure we'll love. So, are dynamic events triggered manually, or is there some logic in place that triggers the events based on a condition? For example, if there is a high density of crime stats on a server. So there are other, I wouldn't call them dynamic events, but they are of a sort, where if you have a high crime stat, and a number of people with you also do, your combined crime stat heat will cause stronger NPC ships to come protect a place. Ben Dorsey says here, currently these events are triggered manually by a dev in an office. It's absolutely planned to have these events be driven by quanta, so the AI virtual NPCs within the game, and player actions. we will be talking about this a bit in Digital Citizen Con, so stay tuned for that for more info. So that's in about a month's time. So can we expect to see video feeds via Mobiglass instead of still images during these events? So Edward Fuller says, yes, in full caps here, you will get to see Dooley's face in mission comms one day. And as we know from interviewing the voice actor for Rowena Dooley, she did a lot of mocap, not just for Dooley, but for all her characters. I think that it's mostly just a technological issue at the moment. That's Anna Dimitriou. So technically, there is always going to be some scenarios in which an NPC is supposed to comms call a player, and that player is not yet streamed in on the client's machine. So we may still, under certain conditions, need to not show their face for this period, maybe with static or an image placeholder instead. That then gets replaced by the face when they stream in. So we would always try to show the face if we can. And that's because, like, the way that the NPCs, when they comm you, either now when a pirate comms you in combat, or if a player comms you, is kind of different from how it is generally speaking in other games, where instead of it just being like a sprite or a GIF or something that, you know, talks to you and it's like lip synced, it's the actual player's model loaded in the game from where it is rendered onto your HUD. So like it would have to spawn in and then transmit, and then you will be able to see it rendered on your screen. And so they need to kind of work out the kinks in order to make it work. All right, so what do you feel was missing in the Ninetales events that made it less engaging than Xenothreat? I would say personally that I don't think that the Ninetales event necessarily respected the player's time. You would get the first call, and then you wouldn't actually be able to do anything about it for over an hour. And then once you got there, then the mission itself would then take about 1.5 hours afterwards. Most people, generally speaking, after a day of work, do not have 3+ hours spare to play Star Citizen, let alone wait just out there in space for an hour, avoiding being, you know, knocked off or whatever in the hopes that they'll get this mission triggered. So Ben Dorsey says, so many things. I'll take this opportunity to do a sort of mini post-mortem. So, there were insufficient medical supplies. There aren't enough medical supplies available for haulers to participate freely in the event. For Ninetales Lockdown, some of you who participated in the very first Evo Conti test might actually remember there were shop mods that made it so the shops selling medical supplies had their sell inventories boosted, much like the station has its buy inventory capacity boosted. We decided to remove those mods to emphasize the derelicts due to Xenothreat feedback. So what they mean by this is that initially, from a gameplay perspective, they were like, oh, okay, this station needs medical supplies. Because of this, other stations are going to ramp up their supply. But they were like, well, one of the huge takeaways from Xenothreat was how much people really enjoyed raiding and clearing out the derelict starfarers. So in order to make it so that people had that and to make that still worth your time, they decided to not add the increase in supply and rather just have the starfarers with medical supplies. Now I think a big issue here was that there were no vocal like cues or anything telling you that starfarers existed with med supplies. It kind of relied on knowledge that you had beforehand that that was a thing that might happen. So Ben then says, thanks to the Ninetales feedback that's come in, I was able to rehash that conversation, and I have hooked up the shop mods to sell locations back up for 315. So once 315 comes in, now we'll be able to do both, which means that people who just want to haul can now just haul, instead of having to leave their ships, go into combat, fight people, clear out their ship, and then go and continue hauling. So it's a win-win. Ben says, we're a bit worried this would be too profitable, but an enjoyable experience is worth a little temporary economic destabilization. That's a bit funny because there is no economic stability at all in Star Citizen. Zero. There is nothing to destabilize. And this is something that can be tuned. Longer term improvements to the shop system should also help this. So players not playing the Ninetales side, they were like 0. There was like a poll that went out. I think Morphologist put one out. I think I put one out. There was one on Twitter. There was one on Reddit. And for the most part, I think only 10% of people in general were like, yeah, I'll play Ninetales side. And the Ninetales side paid so much. You got like 50 grand for killing somebody or something like that. And sadly, the event was closed before we decided to actually go out in force with our Hurricanes and try it out. So Ben says, this is the most painful one for me. Based on our analytics, for every one Ninetales aligned player, there were 20 Crusader aligned players. So forget my 10%, 5% of people actually, 5%. Short term, I'm looking to increase the rewards for the Ninetales, but if I'm being honest, I expect this to have very little impact. Make the rewards Ninetales colored armor or a Ninetales colored ship skin, and you would not have to be so skeptical. Longer term, I requested some tech to deal with Ninetales aligned players being sent to jail, and once players can obtain Ninetales reputation, my hope is that I can move away from using crime stats as a determiner for participation, and thus have players be a bit more long term in what sides they want to align with. So yeah, the big, like, oh yeah, if I die, I go to jail, great, was not very good, you know, like, people playing the CDF side or the CDF side or the Crusader security side even would just be back into it straight away. If you were Ninetales, the moment you died, well, then all your crimes you have to answer for, and you could be, you know, in jail for 20 hours unless you mine or unless somebody breaks you out, in which case you are out of that gameplay for the 1 hour or so gameplay loop it takes for you to break out of prison and then hack your crime stats. So yeah. So the event was too short, says Ben. I kind of disagree, but I suppose different elements were too short. So many players were unable to participate in the event due to it ending before they could log in. Mea culpa, my bad on this one. I set the prologue phase to 1 hour, thinking that should be sufficient. Kind of is, kind of, but if you're already in the game, the prologue of an hour really doesn't respect your time at all. But it does cater to people who may not be in the game because there's nothing to do, or they have nothing that they personally want to do, but a friend is in there and the friend can then say on Reddit or Spectrum or something or Discord, hey, the event's happening soon, and then they can go inside. So this number is dynamically tunable whenever we launch the event, so we will probably extend the prologue a bit in the future. So my only big issue, and this is gonna be some like a personal opinion here, is that, you know, like, because within the game right now, of the things to do, this is what people want to do, dangling this event in front of you for longer than an hour isn't cool. I've also asked that in the future, at least until we have a large enough stable of these events to allow players to regularly log in and find something available, we give a bit more outside the game warning for Ninetales so people can plan to log in. Please do. I know that they have like specialized Twitter accounts for things like the CDF that I do believe, because if these events are supposed to be tied across all servers, that they could easily use to let people know well in advance when things are going to happen. And even when they are eventually dynamic, they could still tie it in that way. So the event was too long and too repetitive. So on the other side of the token, as other systems come into place throughout the game, my hope is that this will naturally evolve a bit. So for instance, one of my least favorite pieces of the event right now is that I send out AI scanner ships for players to defend. I would vastly prefer that I offer this job to players as well, once long distance scanning becomes more of a thing. That'd be really cool for your Terrapins to actually have a use this way, or your Carracks or whatever else can scan. So lastly, someone else's opinion here, or at least like a polled opinion, says it didn't feel like a blockade. So the answer to this was, while flying in, you're not attacked nearly enough by Ninetales AI. This was one we saw coming, but it's not fixable in the short term. It was actually a performance problem combined with a few AI problems. The ships are taking a long time to spawn, so you've already flown by, they're still spawning standing still, and they cannot currently fly fast enough to catch up with you and don't have a way to stop you. Performance will be an ongoing fight, the rest are things that have active discussions about solutions going. Honestly, I did like the idea of there doesn't necessarily have to be a physical blockade to the Ninetales lockdown thing, really. The idea that they had some sort of weird tech that caused a massive quantum blockade like cloud was enough for me. It essentially turns this gas giant into hunting grounds for the Ninetales, as opposed to having just like, how are pirates live in an asteroid supposed to have billions of credits in order to like take on every single player? I kind of liked the idea, at least in my mind. It was like, okay, they have this random item that's able to do this thing. And you know, maybe in the future players might get that too, like a capital sized like quantum jammer. Alright, so will we see more Ninetales events pop up now that Xenothreat is over? I think the community wants more of these random events popping up, but I haven't seen any Ninetales events pop up in the past few weeks. Thanks for your hard work. So Ben says, likely yes, though running these events is always a conversation with several other departments. We might hold off until after 3.15. I would like to get some minor fixes in. That being said, Ninetales Lockdown is an evergreen event, so all the time system, like a season, all seasons, an event for all seasons, yeah. It's intended to run occasionally forever. We just want to avoid burning you all out on it, which is fair enough. So, I noticed that during the Xenothreat and Ninetales lockdown, the enemy used a lot of military spec grade ships. Military spec Idris M's, Anvil Arrows, Vanguards, Wardens, etc. Yeah, so much for Drake being the pirate ship of choice. So, was this to balance the battles, or should we be worried that the UEE Navy's shipyards are being hijacked? So Luke says, the Xenothreat's lore is that they're mostly ex-Navy, so it's reasonable to assume that they have had access to Navy shipyards that others would not. Also, they would prefer to fly ships they were accustomed to. That's my excuse and I'm sticking to it. As for Ninetales flying military ships, I've just reviewed the ships available with the Ninetales paint job and the majority are not military ships, so I assume you're referring to the Idris M, which I agree. It might have been better to replace with an Idris P. However, the instruction for development of the event was to make it as efficiently as possible, which meant relying on existing assets, and the Idris M was proven working. I think, though, other ships like the luxury ships, the performance ships, the M50s, the origin ships should not have been part of the Ninetales group. I think even they had Anvil Valkyries, didn't they? That makes no sense. Alright, so the last question now. Thus far, the dynamic events are based on performing the same actions over and over to build up rep and earn AUEC. Will there be events in the future that are true events that we only participate in once and reap staggering rewards, or fail and the event ends without allowing us to try again, making it a very high risk, high reward scenario? So Edward Fuller says, yes, we want to be able to do this. Currently, we replay events to get as much data as possible and help us refine the implementations of the systems and mechanics that are the focus of those events. As we build our mission logic in a modular way, and as our array of modules increases, we will be able to build these events faster. The story elements and locations of any given event can then be one of the aspects we focus on to make them more unique and one-offs. Alright, so guys, that is that for this month's Q&A. Thank you all so much for listening, and thank you everybody on Twitch for watching and for talking and for adding your own conversation to this. Sorry if I wasn't really focusing on chat at all. It's just a lot of content, and so I was trying to get through it. If you're watching on YouTube, thank you so much for watching as well. Please, if you would like to support the channel, all you need to do is just hit the like button there. maybe subscribe, leave a comment in the description, and we'll see you in the next one. For those of you, sorry, who have followed the channel because they were into my lore post videos, rest assured we will be getting the next lore post video up in about 7 days or so, give or take. It's not a huge one, but it's going to be a start to that pipeline. I believe that we have the help of Red Knight from our community helping us with audio now, and Mr. Hazgaha, who did things like the Atmo esports trailers and stuff like that, and winner of a whole bunch of SC video competitions, helping us with some of the video and stuff. So it's gonna be a little bit of a more higher production value than I suppose my usual like stream rips and that kind of thing. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be happening on the channel very soon. However, until that, hit the like button and stuff, and I'll see you next time. Until then, guys, as always, be good.